The introduction, Scott, and thank you all for attending today or watching this later. I really I like doing these, and I'm glad when they're useful to people. So today, the topic is emotional and sexual affairs. This could be its own standalone weekly webinar navigating issues around this. So keep in mind today, my goal is not to look at every single facet of how to heal from affairs and emotional or sexual affairs. And I think this even goes into sexual acting out. We'll see in a lot of partners of heavy porn users that they respond and experience it as a threat to the relationship, much in the same way that an actual affair or a physical affair does. So my goal today is to give an overview, some things to think about, some things to consider in your own healing. And I think most importantly at the outset, I'm going to say this is a delicate emotional surgery to heal from this. So please, please, please find somebody qualified to help you with if you're in this camp and needing this help. I think I have in my notes here a little later on where you can go to find some qualified people to help. Oh, here it is. I'll do this right now. Ask any of the sex and relationship healing staff. They do a really good job at getting to know people who are competent and trained and helpful in healing betrayal issues. I know you guys also have a what's it called, an intensive for couples post betrayal.
Yeah, we do.
When you do find a prospective therapist, I would recommend that you interview them before you go in for a session, if that's a possibility, and it doesn't have to take long. A couple minutes on the phone can give you a feel for what it's going to feel like to work with that person. And because this is such a delicate emotional surgery, you want to make sure that there's a lot of trust that you have with the people that you're inviting to help you and your partner heal. There's a lot out there to read about this. My suggestion would not be to read it all and to try to become an expert yourself. Because as with most things mental health, if you read enough, you'll find contradictory information, and it can get very, very confusing. So if you're the partner who's been betrayed, I recommend you start with a book about betrayal trauma and the experience of a partner, and digest that piece by piece. Get your own therapist, get your own support. If you're the one who's done the betraying, Out of the Doghouse by Dr. Weiss, Dr. Rob. He doesn't go by Dr. Weiss, does he? It's Dr.
He
Rob.
likes to be Dr. Rob. Yeah, I don't know. More approachable, I guess.
I knew him back when he was just Rob Weiss. So
yeah, me too. Just Rob.
So Dr. Rob's book, Out of the Doghouse, is a fantastic place to start with that. And I think that's the key when you're seeking information on how to heal from this is don't try to take in everything all at once. Take a bite at a time, because this is a very long-term thing. That dovetails into where I wanted to start today was there's no one way that infidelity affects a relationship, and there's no one way that it looks. So keep in mind that what you read, what you hear from others, that could be speaking about an experience that's not yours. So if you're feeling something, if you're not feeling something, if something happened with relation to infidelity, something didn't happen in relation to infidelity, there is no, this is what it normally looks like. I think that's why there's so much written about it, because there's so many different experiences. So because there's no one way that it affects a relationship, that's why I think getting started talking in general is helpful. So in general, infidelity tends to make both partners feel insecure about the relationship. Oftentimes the partner who's been betrayed will think, is he going to do this again? Or is she going to do this again? Am I really safe? Often what I've seen with the one who's done the betraying is they carry around a fear that says something like, can they really accept me after this? Can things really be forgiven? Can things really be worked through? That has a lot more to do with that person's own shame and the things that they need to work through than it does their partner's actual ability to heal. The commitment in the relationship, and I've said this before, commitment when we talk about relationships means the level of fear we have that our partner is going to hurt us. So commitment is shredded in an affair for both. Because the one who's done the cheating, the one who's done the affair, understandably, they have an angry partner who sometimes can be retaliatory and sometimes can be vindictive with good reason. That doesn't come out of nowhere. So keep in mind that when it comes to healing infidelity, both parties are really, really afraid of each other, and really scared to be hurt further. In order to start healing from an affair or a betrayal, the affair or the betrayal has to be over before attempting the repair for obvious reasons. So this applies to sexual acting out as well. I generally don't work with couples unless there's some kind of sobriety established. Meaning I don't work with couples on couples issues. I can work with couples as we're working to establish sobriety, but really moving into repairing the relationship, we have to be assured that there's not more betrayal just right around the corner. I'd said a little earlier that the commitment is shredded for both parties in an affair and a betrayal. And it's important to recognize that the fabric of the relationship can be repaired. It's just not a quick fix. And I'll often have couples who come to me post infidelity and they'll say something like, how long is this going to take? I get where that question comes from. There's no helpful answer to that question. Again, because every relationship is different and the impact of infidelity on every relationship is different. I tell couples, if you have a commitment to becoming empathetic and understanding of each other, if you have a commitment to protecting each other rather than hurting each other, the amount of time that this is going to take is going to be well worth it, and you guys are going to be glad you did the work. One of the ways that we repair the relationship is to address the components of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder that remain after an accident, or not an accident, an affair. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead to my metaphor here. And this can be true for both parties. So, think of someone who causes a traffic accident. They can still suffer from PTSD. They can still suffer from bodily injury because of that, even though it's their fault, so to speak. So that's important to keep in mind as you work on healing after an affair and healing your relationship after an affair. Both of you can suffer from hypervigilance. Both of you can suffer from overappraisal of threat. So qualified help is going to help you both identify the PTSD symptoms that you're dealing with, and to effectively work through and heal some of those responses. When we're in PTSD response, we don't have room or bandwidth for what I would call luxuries in life. We're very survival focused. And unfortunately, when it comes to a relationship of your choosing that is secure, that's safe, that's a luxury. We don't need that for survival. We do need safe, connected relationships to function well. But when we're in survival mode, we're not looking to make our relationships safe and secure. We're just looking to make it to the next day. So addressing PTSD symptoms are really important early on in recovery from an affair. So treatment for PTSD is essentially learning what your triggers are and how those triggers come to be for you, and most importantly, knowing how to make yourself feel safe in response to that. So when I work with clients in relationships on PTSD, we do a lot of work around boundaries, not as a way to give your partner this to-do list, but more as a way of offering the insight. So for example, when I'm working with couples where there's been sexual betrayal, oftentimes let's say the wife in the case is the one who's been betrayed. Often they'll have this really obvious boundary that will say something like, don't cheat on me ever again. I won't be able to do another round of this. A lot of times their spouse can take that as this, see, they just tell me what to do and they don't trust me. Really what I see that as it's stating the obvious. I've learned that I'm not a very good person when my partner cheats on me and I'm kind of blown out of my window of tolerance and my way of reasonable functioning. So if you want to help me to be a good person, don't cheat on me again. That's what boundaries are about, is informing ourselves and informing the people around us what we need to function optimally. And to me, that's the core of PTSD treatment, is learning what your own boundaries are and being able to live in a way that supports your optimal functioning rather than living in a way where we're just waiting for the next shoe to fall. The way to actually start processing the infidelity is the person who's been betrayed needs to be able to ask questions about what happened, why it happened. Sometimes they need to know where it happened in order to establish a narrative within themselves that they can make sense of, and that they can know how to get safe in response to. So the person who's been betrayed, their job is to be able to engage enough to ask the questions to get the information they need to establish safety. The job of the person who's done the betraying is to be able to answer those questions truthfully and non-defensively. That's the heart of processing an affair. Now, in the way that I've been trained, I facilitate formal disclosures, which are a version of this. We tend to slow it way down and write letters and work really closely with individual therapists to make sure that both parties are ready to receive truth and to give truth and to do that in a non-defensive way. But that's the heart of repairing the fabric of the relationship, is thoroughly processing what happened, and developing a culture of truth and developing a culture of safety and respect in the relationship, so that both people's nervous systems can start to feel like, I can lean into this relationship and it will be safer than it's not. It helps to, in this process for both for both people, it really helps to learn how to express our feelings non-contemptuously, or non-aggressively. So this is a huge piece of work I see for both parties. Often the person who's done the betraying, they'll have some kind of resentment or some kind of grudge about something that hasn't been working in the relationship for a while. I would say often, well, 100% of the times, that's not the reason why they had the affair. That's the justification. But the feelings that are there are important to share, and they're important to explore. However, I remember when I was in school and I learned about I feel statements, and I thought that's the dumbest thing in the world, because you could just say to somebody, I feel like you're a real stupid jerk. That's not the spirit of I feel statements. I feel statements are really getting focused on, this is what I'm feeling, this is what's going on for me, and staying away from attack, blame, shame, all of those other things that we can inadvertently heap on each other. So as you're working on processing what happened in the affair, or in the infidelity, keep in mind the way that you express your emotions can make a really big difference in how your partner hears that on both sides. So that's an important piece of personal work. A key piece that we know the processing the affair is done is that an apology can be given. So for a lot of the folks I work with who betray, there's a lot of work to do to overcome some shame, overcome some pride, to be able to humbly admit the mistake that was made and the impact of that mistake. And there's a lot of work on the other side too, of being able to accept that when it's given genuinely. So when I'm working with couples, that's kind of what I'm looking for, to know, okay, we've processed this, and now we can move on to some other aspects of the relationship. Because what I find that couples where there's infidelity, there's really a couple things they need to work on. First is the betrayal and processing that, and second is all of the normal relationship issues they had before the betrayal. And I want to be really careful to note there, I'm not saying the normal relationship issues that caused the betrayal, because that's not how it works. But for 100% of the couples I work with, betrayal is not their only issue that brings them into the office. We just have to deal with that first. So when a couple's in a place where apology can be given in an authentic, real way, and it can actually be received, we've essentially started a new chapter. And there may be times where we go back to the pain and the uncertainty of the betrayal. But when the work has been done to process that, we're not living there for weeks at a time. It may be some reference, or, hey, I'm really hurting today, or I'm really uncertain today. And when the work has been done, that can be met with the betraying partner. That can be met with compassion. That can be met with understanding, and most importantly, non-defensively. Relationships need to be rebuilt and restructured after processing. And that will, like I mentioned earlier, that's going to include talking about problems that preceded the affair. It's important not to go there too early. So this is something to look for when you're looking for professional help with this. I would be cautious about working with a therapist who wants to dive in too early to relationship issues without thoroughly processing the affair. What happens in there is I think that the person who's betrayed can feel blamed, which isn't helpful. And I've met with couples who have worked with other marriage therapists before coming to me, and ironically, I think the person who did the betraying will say something like, I don't feel like it was useful to harp on my wife for the things that maybe get under my skin. I really want to get to the business of healing things, and I really want to get to the business of being able to apologize. And that other stuff felt like a distraction. So there is a right time for that post affair recovery. But that's really priority number one, is addressing the PTSD symptoms in both parties, being able to ask the questions that are we need answers to in order to establish some safety and to develop a culture of truth, respect, honesty, and safety. So that is the 30,000-foot view of healing from emotional and sexual affairs. Like I said, this could be a standalone webinar and have weekly installments. So I'll try to answer all of the questions that come in. You can ask questions about this specifically or questions about relationships and recovery in general. We've got time for that.
Sure. Jon, thank you so much. I just want to reiterate the point you made about every relationship has issues, often long-standing, but rarely do they have anything to do with the decision to cheat.
Yeah.
And in the process of healing, the presenting crisis is the cheating, and that has to be processed first, and then you can go back and work on all the other little niggly issues that
Yep.
Of the relationship. But there's no point in doing that before you try to heal from the cheating, because it just doesn't work.
It's the elephant in the room for both parties. And like I mentioned earlier, for the one who's been cheated on, they need to have the question answered, will they do this to me again? They need to know what the answer to that is. And for the party who's done the cheating, they really need to be able to feel, they need to have the question answered, can this person really forgive me?
Yeah.
Can we really have a relationship after this? To try to address anything else before both parties have those questions answered, it's missing the elephant in the room.
Yeah, the loss of trust and the loss of safety for both parties, often much more for the betrayed partner, but really for both parties, has to be addressed before anything else can. So, yeah. We do have a couple questions, so let's get started. This is from follow-up from last night. I filled in with Rob last night, and we talked about disclosure and polygraphs. So I heard Scott yesterday speak about polygraphs. I am with someone who has both passed and failed multi-questioned and intensive polygraphs during his time acting out over the past 5+ years. Would you still recommend that a polygraph be used alongside disclosure? I don't know if I would even trust a polygraph at this point. Jon, do you have thoughts on polygraphs in general, particularly as part of disclosure?
Yeah, I have a lot of mixed feelings about polygraphs. I think they can be useful if both parties see it as a ritual that can restore trust. So the person who's taking the polygraph takes it seriously, and they really work to bring their level of honesty up to a level where they know going in that they're going to pass the polygraph because they've been truthful. And the partner who's either requesting the polygraph or receiving the results has confidence that that ritual is going to help them establish the truth of what happened. Now, polygraphs are not 100% reliable. I always tell my clients they're not admissible as evidence in court. And a lot of the outcome of the polygraph, the research is showing, which there's not a whole lot of in relation to this, but the research is showing the way that the polygrapher does it has a big outcome on the reliability of the polygraph. And there's some really specific nuances with working with betrayal. So for me in this question, the key point is the last thing that this person says. I don't know if I would even trust a polygraph at this point. I think it's really important for you to look at the components that are going into trying to do some relationship repair, some healing for yourself. If there's any component of that you don't know if you could trust, I would slow down and resolve those concerns first, or decide that it doesn't need to be part of it. If your therapist, substitute polygraph for my therapist. If you were saying the same thing about your therapist, I would say, whoa, don't go forward with this process yet until you figure out how you feel about your therapist and resolve any issues there. And I think it's the same thing with a polygraph. They can give false positives and they can give false negatives. They can also be gamed. They're not completely reliable. I had an instance with an addict that I was working with recently who gave a polygraph and he passed, but there was information that he left out. Polygraphs measure the part of the person who's present answering the questions, and sometimes the person who's answering the questions and the person who did the deed are not the same person. There can be high levels of dissociation that can change how people show up physiologically, and that's all that the polygraph can measure. So it's not a one-size-fits-all tool for reestablishing trust. But like I said, it can be helpful if both parties are bought into the trust restoring ritual aspect of it.
Yeah. I think I said last night, I'm a big fan of polygraphs, especially in conjunction with disclosure, but, with the caveats that Jon just gave, and not every polygrapher is experienced with infidelity. You need somebody who really knows how to deal with infidelity. And the reason I'm a big fan is partly because, if both parties are vested in truth and saving the relationship, I'm a big fan of the polygraph. Because particularly from the addict's perspective, because it's that extra layer of accountability. I know I'm taking a polygraph. I damn well better get all of it out in my disclosure. And then follow-up polygraphs, it's again an extra layer of accountability. That's why I like them. But you've clearly had an experience that is maybe not so great, and that you're questioning them. So as Jon said, work through that before you agree to it. Because otherwise, what's the point? Yeah. So next question here. I really need some support. After 11 years, my partner discarded me out of the blue. I was crushed and started learning about NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and codependence now. Yay, you're learning the terms. And I started working on myself. I chased him for years, and it was the hardest thing to let him go after almost a year. He came back to me, and this was the first time he approached me, and I appreciated it very much. After 4 months, he left me again, and I let him go. He came back after 8 months. I gave him the time to figure out what was going on. Now he fails me big time in support and empathy. On 1st of December, I was so angry I called to say it was over. I gave him 3 to 5 years, but I felt so guilty. I contacted him again, but of course the same behavior. And at the beginning of January, I just did not answer his phone call. He has not contacted me again, and I feel so guilty and so bad about myself. How can I overcome this?
There's few emotions I see really kind of make the feeling in the relationship murky, like guilt and obligation. And for you, that's where I would focus on personally right now, is why this guilt? Because I hear in some of the story, there's one party that's really proud of yourself for saying, I'm not taking this anymore. You haven't been there for me. This hasn't been a good relationship for me. And then the other part feels really guilty for telling somebody no. What I see with folks who struggle with that kind of yo-yo relationship, when there's this aspect of guilt, understanding why the guilt comes in for you, and why you might experience relationships that could include components of love and respect, and all of that can also include components of obligation and guilt. Getting those things sorted out internally can make a really, really big difference. Guilt and shame are some of the hardest emotions for humans to tolerate. So we have all sorts of ways that we kind of short circuit that and stop feeling it. I would say for you, if you're working with a qualified therapist, talk to them about the guilt that you feel, and really, really focus on seeing if you can have some shifts there. Because I would guess if your compass point can change from guilt and obligation to love of yourself, love of another person, love including acceptance and all of that, I think you might be seeing this really differently. You might be seeing your actions less of, did I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing? And more of, I took the steps that I needed to in order to be healthy and whole. And I'm proud of that. But I would definitely focus on the guilt part for yourself.
Jon, can you talk in a kind of a very, very, very general way about how sort of unresolved early life trauma can play into feelings like that later in life?
Yeah, yeah, and I think for a lot of people, the level of guilt and obligation that gets set in a relationship, it's not necessarily from really horrific things that happened. It can be things as simple as, when my wife and I started having children, I wanted to make it a point before our first was born to have a talk with my mother-in-law, because I'd seen her with her other grandkids, and the ritual was when it was time to leave, whether you want to or not, you have to give grandma a hug. And I know this woman, I don't think she has any ill intentions. Like, I think that was just like, oh, I'm your grandma, you got to give me a hug. And doing the work that I do and having worked through what I've worked through with myself, I told her before our kids were born, you can't do that with my kids. If they want to give you a hug, they'll give you a hug. And if they don't, you're going to need to be a big person about that and be okay with the fact that a 18-month-old just wanted to be obstinate that day and didn't feel like hugging grandma. So some of that guilt and obligation can come from those really simple interactions. You owe me this. Do you recognize how much I've done for you? Why can't you just do this for me? Shame actually plays a role, I think a helpful role in groups, and that's letting us know when we've stepped on each other's toes, when we've done something that might hurt somebody else. That's the shame that comes up naturally. It can be a natural response. Shame that's laid on us or guilt that's laid on us is not helpful at all. That's manufactured. So some of those early experiences about messages you might have gotten about your ability to make choices in your relationship, that can influence how you experience this. I see between genders a lot. Like we tend to socialize women to be caretakers and selfless. And I would say my female clients have a lot harder time with the concept of self-care and getting that going than my male clients do generally. So, those early messages we get about how we're supposed to be in relationships and what relationships are for and what constitutes being a good partner versus a bad partner. A lot of times those rules we walk away with aren't necessarily helpful, especially when we're dealing with something complex or abusive. So that early trauma, those early messages that may not be useful anymore, are so helpful to look at unwinding, because it's not a cognitive thing. I learned this thing when I was 3 and it's just always stuck with me. It's a body thing. We feel out of sorts if we're not living in alignment with that rule that we're supposed to give and not take, that we're supposed to be more concerned about others' feelings than we are our own. So paying attention to how those messages register in your body, I think, helps a lot with sorting some of this stuff out.
Yeah. This individual also mentioned that she started looking at narcissistic personality disorder in relation to her partner. I assume this is a female question and a male partner, if I'm wrong, sorry. But can you talk a little bit about what narcissistic personality disorder is, and how you're a true narcissist and sometimes it's a defense mechanism that just looks like narcissism?
Yeah. I really
unpleasant either way.
Yeah,
it's really unpleasant either way.
I really like the book by Craig Malkin, Rethinking Narcissism, because he talks about this spectrum. And what narcissism is it's a self-interest, and we actually need a level of healthy narcissism. We need a level of where we can disconnect from what's going on around us and we can look at our best interest. A healthy level of narcissism allows us to do that and make an evaluation, but then also return to the relationships that are important to us and weigh the costs and the benefits. So there's going to be some times where it's really better for me to say no than it is for me to say yes. And you might be disappointed that I say no, but if my self-interest is not my only stance that I can take with the relationship, If it's not the only answer that I can give, then we have a healthy level of looking out for ourselves. Narcissistic features I see a lot with folks who struggle with addiction because they really don't know the first thing about relationships or caring for themselves. So they default to what our brains and bodies default to in every situation when we don't know what else to do is I'll take care of myself. In true narcissism, this is a person with a personality structure who can't tolerate not feeling special, and they can't tolerate risk and vulnerability in a relationship. So they organize themselves and they organize their relationships where either you're somebody that I can impress or you're somebody that I can use to impress others. And if you're not either of those, you're a threat to me and I've got to eliminate you or discard you in some way. That's true narcissism. What I'll see in the addicts, for example, that I work with that have features, they actually experience remorse when they treat somebody badly. They'll think like, gosh, I don't want my relationship to feel this way. They may attempt apologies. They may not be skilled at it and they may not know how to sustain that kind of change, but someone will see with true narcissism, they don't register a lot of regret for how they treat other people. In fact, they justify their bad behavior again through the lens of, you've really hurt me, you've really victimized me, so you had this coming.
Yeah. I mean, true narcissists they're often very successful. But they're often very unpleasant. Whereas people who use narcissistic behaviors as a defense, they're capable of empathy, they're capable of healing, they're capable of real mutual relationships.
Yeah. So. What I tell my clients who are in a similar situation here, I think there can be a level of learning about your partner's, for lack of a better term, dysfunction or dis-ease. But I tell my clients when they're looking into this, when you start reading this and it doesn't feel grounding anymore, it doesn't feel calming to you, like the puzzle pieces are coming together, then it's time to return the focus back to yourself. It's time to return the focus about, like in this case, it's time to turn the focus back to, why am I having so much guilt in this? Let me look at that and return to that. Because again, this is another one of those areas that I see a lot of my betrayed clients, they can identify with these narratives about narcissism, and some of them, they pursue it too much. And so then their focus becomes on understanding everything about narcissism, which at the end of the day, it's not going to make sense to somebody who's not narcissistic, because you'll end up thinking like, well, why don't they feel bad about that? Or why doesn't this work? And it doesn't, so learning about your partner to the extent it helps you feel calm is really, really helpful. At the end of the day, what you can do with your own feelings is, I think, how you make the most progress.
Yeah, but when it crosses that line from helping you feel calm and like a little bit more about what's going on into you're obsessing about it and you're trying to control it and what we would call codependent. Then it's time to put it away. Yep. and do some deep breathing or whatever it is that helps you feel calm and safe. So ask us more questions. I've got a couple here. Jon, you mentioned that you need to effectively set the no more cheating boundary. And you talked about that a little bit, but can you kind of expand on boundaries kind of in general and how to set them in an effective way?
Yeah.
It's really difficult for most of us.
Yeah. It helps me a lot to understand that boundaries are not demands. They're requests for a more collaborative relationship. And sometimes the language that we use is that kind of absolute, like, you cannot do this to me again. I can't tolerate it. You have to stop. But that's not a, you have to stop or else. It's the, I won't do well. The boundary always focuses, I always tell my clients, if you're setting a boundary that you cannot enforce without your partner's buy-in, it's not a real boundary for you. So to be able to say to your partner, I can't take another affair, I can't take another betrayal. If you're going to set that as a boundary, you need to be prepared to follow through. Whether that looks like, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I'm going to need to get some space so I can reevaluate what it is I'm doing in this relationship. At the very least, I'm going to have to share with you my real feelings about this. I'm going to be angry with you. I'm going to be confused. Whatever the boundary is we set, we have to look at, am I willing to respond to this? If there's a violation of the boundary, am I willing to respond to this in a way that will help me, that will reestablish safety for me? I think it's also helpful to understand that boundaries aren't a, if you do this, then I will always do this. It's a recognition of the feelings that maybe a violation puts us in, and we give ourselves a menu of options to choose from. So when I'm working with couples and there's issues around continued relapse, I'll often have partners look at me and say, well, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Because I don't want to leave him, but I don't want him doing this anymore. And I'll say something like, would it be an option for you, or could you ever see yourself hurt enough by a relapse that you might want to leave the house for a day or two, or ask him to leave the house for a day or two so that you can get grounded and kind of hear your own voice and your own feelings again? Is it also possible that after a relapse, you may just want him to know how you feel? And so you may say, one of the ways that I'm going to respond to relapse is I'm going to tell you what's going on. I'm going to be honest about my feelings. And that may include me saying things like, I'm really disappointed that you did this again. That may be saying things like, I'm really angry with you and I'm having a hard time wanting to be close to you right now. So giving yourself a lot of options to follow through with helps you to stay accountable for caring for yourself, which is really what boundaries are all about. Again, it's that defining, in this space, I do pretty good. In this space, I'm healthy, I'm grounded. And response to boundaries are designed to get us back into the space where we can function well. And when we include another person in the boundaries, it's an invitation for them to help us maintain safe space and sane space around ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Jon. One of the things that was helpful for me when I was learning about boundaries was it was impressed upon me that my boundaries are not about the other person. They're not about controlling someone else's behavior. My boundaries are in place to control my behavior.
Yep.
How I will respond. And the boundaries involve, saying, when you do this, I tend to feel this. And, if you do that again, these are the possible ways I might respond. But it's not saying don't ever do this again, or else. That's not what it is. It's about, this is what I will do to protect myself.
Yep.
And that was a weird lesson for me to learn. I thought boundaries were about keeping other unsafe people out, but they're not. They're about letting people in safely.
Yeah, I really like skin as a metaphor for boundary. It does play a role in keeping out what doesn't belong in our bodies, like disease, dirt, other people. It also, I think, more importantly, plays the role of keeping inside what needs to be inside. It helps with temperature regulation. It keeps our blood and organs in place, along with muscles and bones and things like that. And there are times where we might invite somebody inside that barrier because it could be helpful for us. Like, I think of a sexual relationship that can include that, or, in an everyday example, like you might invite a surgeon to cut your skin open because there may be something that you need some help with inside. But when the boundaries are really for us and they're about us, and when we exercise boundaries, they need to be about choices that we're making, not about choices we want another person to make.
Well stated. Gonna follow up here. I find it very difficult because there are mixed opinions about whether someone with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, can heal. Some people say it can with intervention and good help. Others say no, it's not possible. That's why I gave it so much time and hope. I cannot find expert help for me here in my part of the world, let alone for him. Thoughts on that, Jon?
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated about Craig Malkin's work on narcissism is he basically says whether or not your loved one changes is up to them. And he outlines, if you want to be helpful in that change process, here are some things that you might consider contributing to the relationship that can help a more narcissistic person come out of their shell and accept vulnerability and lay down the control. But he puts a big caveat on there. It's like, if you have the energy and if you really want to do this for this person, here are some ways you might get started. But at the end of the day, like most things I see people in my office for, the concept of, I get asked all the time, fill in the blank, can I heal from this? And my answer is usually something like, that's mostly up to you. If you want to be committed to figuring out how to live in a different way that works better for you and for your relationships, you can definitely make movement with that. As with every other thing that I see, when I have hope for someone who's more narcissistically inclined, it's because they're bought into the fact that this is not working. It's really hard to help somebody change who doesn't see a problem with what they're doing. And so I often ask the spouses of narcissistic people that I work with, if nothing changes and what you're looking at is as good as it gets, what are you going to need if you choose to continue in this relationship? I think taking the potential that your partner changes off the table helps you to get really clear on what you really want and what you can actually do sustainably. I don't think it's fair. And if the universe could be balanced, relationships with difficult people would not work this way. But I think regardless of what the issue is in your relationship, that's what relationships are mostly about, is asking yourself, if this is as good as it gets, how can I be the best person that I can be in this relationship? And if the answer to that is yes, how do I get there? That's really where I think people get sanity and healing in relationships.
Yeah, I'm going through that in my own life with someone right now. That if a narcissistic person who's not going to change, and I'm having to make the decision. This is as good as it's going to get. Can I live with this? What do I need to continue in this relationship? And am I going to be able to get that? And if I'm not, what am I going to do about it?
Yeah.
And it's a really uncomfortable place to be, because I want some control. I want the other person to change. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I am at the point, this is as good as it gets. Where do I go from here? Where are my boundaries to protect myself from here? Because it's no longer about the other person. It's about me.
Yeah.
What will I tolerate and what will I not tolerate?
I've mentioned this resource before, and I've found it really useful. I think it really goes hand in hand with codependency and Dr. Rob's concepts there. The craft intervention model, which Smart Family and Friends teaches to people who love someone, primarily who's addicted and either not wanting to change or at some part in the change process. But there's smart recovery family and friends groups that you can drop in on via the internet, phone. There's the prodependence groups that Sex and Relationship Healing offers. And they provide some really practical tools for, if you're deciding to stay with this relationship, here's how you can do that in a sane, safe, and happy way.
Yeah. The craft model and prodependence are really sort of tightly intertwined in a lot of ways. Can you talk a little bit more about the craft model and how people might be able to find out about it?
Yeah. So the premise of the craft model, they call it an intervention model. And if you think of like the stereotypical intervention, it's ambushing this person who needs to change with people who love them and browbeating them into treatment. That's what a traditional intervention is. The craft intervention model, instead of looking at getting that person to change now, primarily it focuses on caring for yourself when your loved one may pose some danger emotionally or physically, but also focusing on warm invitations to change and making change the more attractive option for your partner. Rather than trying to punish the addiction, we make change and help as attractive as we can. And we do that in a way that even if your partner says no to the change you're inviting them to make, you can still engage in a life that's happy and supportive. Some of the research on the craft model suggests that where a lot of more traditional interventions are about 30% effective at getting people into treatment, the Craft model is above 70% effective at getting people into good treatment. And over 90% of the people who use the Craft model or things like you said, they're really closely related to codependence. And over 90% of the people who utilize that feel happier whether or not their loved one changes. And so I love those two concepts as a way of bringing the focus back to yourself while still being able to love someone who struggles, and still, if you choose to be committed to that person, being able to do that in a way that you don't have to sacrifice all of your happiness to do so.
Yeah, I just posted a link in the chat feature for people who want to learn more about the Craft model, because it is really interesting, and I think it does go sort of hand in hand with healing, no matter what the other person does. That's kind of a lot what works about it. One of the other, I've got another question for you. One of the other things that you mentioned was, as part of the healing process and relationship, apologies are necessary, and accepting apologies are necessary. In my experience, part of the apology or part of the amends is, I'm really sorry for what I did. Here is what I'm going to do differently in the future, and then following it up. Can you talk a little bit about that and the things that need to be part of that and that need to happen after the apology?
Yeah. So when I work with folks on the restitution part of this, almost across the board, what I hear people say is, I'm starting to realize just how hollow the words "I'm sorry" are by themselves. And a lot of them will recognize I've really overused that. I've tried to make my partner feel better by just saying I'm sorry rather than helping my partner feel safe. So some pieces of an effective apology, it's actual empathizing with the person who's been hurt. So some of the more effective apologies I've seen, the person who did the hurting will say, if I were in your shoes, I imagine it would have felt like this. And they're giving their partner a narrative that's not just a regurgitation of what their partner's already said to them, but they're kind of adding their own experience, their own feelings to that. And when I've seen that done effectively, what I see from the partner is like, you just put words to something that I didn't feel like I could express. Thank you so much for seeing me in that way. That makes me feel like you really do understand what I've been through. It's really hard to intentionally hurt somebody that we really understand and we really love. And so an apology, I think, is a demonstration of an understanding of why that person feels hurt, and not just a regurgitation of the reasons why that person says they feel hurt, but we show with our feelings and with our actions that we understand. Constructive plans for the future, I think, are necessary as well. It's really hollow, I think, for someone who's cheated, and especially like when they've cheated multiple times and been caught multiple times, to say, all right, yep, I'm done with that. You don't have to worry about this anymore. And there's no plan for follow through. I don't think so. The saying from AA comes to mind that my own best thinking got me here. So when it comes to betrayal, I think constructive plans include, I'm not just going to be thinking for myself on this. It may be, I'm engaging in recovery work with my therapist. I have a support group. I'm going to continue, reading information about, if I'm still struggling with sobriety, I'm going to read information about addiction recovery. If I'm not struggling with sobriety, a really important part of addiction recovery is maintaining balance in our lives. And what I'll see for people who are in long-term recovery where they're prone to relapse is where life gets out of balance. And so, commitments to, even as part of the apology, is as part of how I'm going to make things right, I'm going to make sure that I take care of myself so that I don't get so stretched and so out there in a way that betraying you feels like a good idea to me. I think you've got to be really, really specific about what you're going to do to address the problems. And that might include I'm going to continue to listen to you when you express hurt to me. I'm going to continue to work on being defensive. For a lot of the enmeshed men that I work with, some of their amends includes, I'm going to tell you hard things, even if I'm going to tell you the truth, even if I know that it will be hard for you to hear. I'm not going to protect you I'm not going to feel like I'm protecting you by lying to you anymore. So I'd say those are some pretty important components of an apology. Some people would say the words "I'm sorry" are necessary. for an apology. I think also asking for forgiveness in the end is a pretty important component of that, whether or not forgiveness is given in that moment or ever forgiven. I think asking for that recognition of I've hurt you and it's up to you whether or not we can bond again, and an understanding that person may never choose to let you in the same way again. I think that demonstrates some of the reality and some of the humility and takes some of the entitlement out of it.
Yeah, and I mean, so many times I think we see, gosh, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again. Here's a new ring. Now let's move on, and that's just not how it works. Because that's not going to be received as genuine. There's no actual remorse in that.
I think it's really hard to give an effective apology to someone that you haven't really listened to and really worked to reach an understanding of the hurt that they feel and why they feel that hurt. What I see mostly when people say, yeah, I know that you're hurt, what they're dismissing is how uncomfortable it is to face what they've done and the consequences of that. And that goes a really long way in being able to offer effective apology, is when the person who you've hurt knows that you've listened to them.
Yeah. We've got time for maybe one more question. We'll give a few seconds here. Anyone? We have a small group today. So, Jon, anything you want to add about this topic? I have a list of questions, but we don't have enough time to.
I
go crazy.
Sorry, did another question come in?
No, not yet. No.
I think one of the things that I would add here is most people that I know, they thought they knew how they would respond to an affair or infidelity until it happened to them. A lot of people that I know have said, like, if my spouse ever cheated on me, it would be over, just over. And the vast majority of people that I work with, that's not the case for them. You really can't know what it's going to be like for you until you get there. And however you respond to it is, it's part of the process. So there's no wrong way to feel about it. A lot of spouses who choose to stay can feel, they can feel stupid or they can feel weak because they chose to stay. And to me, it's not about intelligence, or it's not about strength at all. I think there's a lot of reasons why we choose what we choose in relationships, and rather than judge it for yourself, I think it's important to explore it. Again, that it's hard to hurt someone, or it's hard to be mean to someone that we understand, and that goes for yourself too. So wherever you're at in the healing, whether you've done the hurting or whether you've been hurt, I think seeking that compassionate understanding of yourself is a really important foundation to being able to move forward.
Yeah, and just to tack onto that, this is somebody that you love and you have a history with. It's not so easy to walk away. It's like walking away from your child because he did something stupid. It's not so easy. And the other thing I wanted to add is, and I know you've experienced this, Jon, because we've talked about it with your clients, is a lot of these relationships, when the couple truly wants to heal and they do the work of healing and trust is rebuilt, they end up feeling closer and more intimately bonded than ever, because they've been through this, and because they've done the work. They've learned how to communicate and be honest and be vulnerable, and it's kind of a beautiful thing.
Yes. Yeah. I don't think that the couples that I've seen work through this, they are not settling for a second best relationship. In fact, I'm thinking of one of the couples that I worked with right now who he'll often say, like, he used to feel like his arms were twisted to talk about anything emotional. And now he's like, I don't know how we got by before having the relationship that we had for 25 years without talking about this stuff. I'm so glad we can do this now. he'll also say to me, if you would have said to me in my early 20s that every aspect of my relationship would be mind-blowingly better than it was in my early 20s, I would have laughed at you. And he said, but my relationship is so much better now because I've put in this work. So yeah, it's not just, it's not settling for a crippled relationship from here on out. Couples who really do get through this, they emerge with something that is so different from what they had before.
And I find just personally that all of my relationships are better because I've learned to be sort of more honest and more vulnerable in all of my relationships, and even with males. And I'm just much closer to my friends now than I ever was before.
Yeah.
And I'm unexpected gift of recovery. So
definitely.
So, yeah, we are out of time. Jon, anything else you want to add before we take off?
Just thank you everybody for coming today. Thank you for the great questions, and I'll be excited to be back on in a couple weeks.
Yeah, Jon is the second and fourth week of every month. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yep. All right. Thanks. Bye.